The Kansas wind was a constant thief, stealing warmth from the sun and topsoil from the fields. It was a restless spirit that scoured the plains and rattled the corrugated metal of Jake's barn, a low moan that was the soundtrack to his life. It was late April, and that wind still carried a winter chill, biting at the exposed skin on his neck as he wrestled the old John Deere across the South 40. This patch of land, stubbornly fallow for a generation, was his last hope. The bank's letters were piling up like snowdrifts against the farmhouse door, each one a stark reminder of his dwindling options. The tractor lurched, its engine groaning in protest before stalling. The plowshares had snagged on something unyielding. Not another limestone slab, he prayed, the frustration hot in his throat. Cursing under his breath, Jake killed the ignition, the sudden silence amplifying the ceaseless whisper of the wind through the dry stubble. He jumped down from the cracked vinyl seat, his worn boots sinking into the dark, loamy soil. He dug around the steel blades with his bare hands, the cold earth numbing his fingers. It wasn't rock, it was bone. He worked carefully then, his initial annoyance dissolving into a solemn reverence. First, a section of a rib cage, stark white against the black earth, then a long, sturdy femur. He unearthed a skull, its empty socket staring up at the vast, indifferent sky. Lying beside it, nestled in the dirt as if placed there with intent, was a clutch of chert arrowheads, their deadly craftsmanship unmistakable. Entangled around a fragment of what looked like a leather wrist guard were beads of shell and turquoise, their faint color a defiant spark in the monochrome landscape. This wasn't just a forgotten grave. It was the final resting place of a warrior. Jake stood slowly, his knees cracking. He wiped the sweat and dirt from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He knew the protocol. Call Sheriff Brody. The State Historical Society would descend, their pristine SUVs a stark contrast to his rusted-out truck. They'd tape off his field, sifting through his soil, his history, his future. The planting window was closing fast. He looked from the ancient remains to the towering, empty grain silos that stood like silent sentinels against the bruised twilight horizon. He couldn't do it. He couldn't turn this man's grave into a bureaucratic spectacle and lose his farm in the process. He would rebury him right here, with respect, but without a priest, without a lawman. Just one man of the land returning another to the earth that claimed them all. The moon was a sliver, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains as Jake returned to the field. He carried a sturdy shovel and a heavy conscience. His wife, Sarah, and their 2 children were asleep, their breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet farmhouse, a sound he was fighting to protect. He worked under the cold gaze of the stars, the only light coming from his headlamp, which cut a nervous beam through the darkness. With a reverence that felt both profound and inadequate, he gently lowered the brittle bones back into the earth. He arranged the chert arrowheads around the skull and laid the strings of turquoise and shell beads across the chest, a silent apology to the spirit he was disturbing. Each shovelful of dirt felt like a betrayal. He wasn't a priest or a shaman. He was just a farmer, a desperate man taking a shortcut with another man's final rest. The soil was loose and fell easily, covering the last vestiges of the warrior until the ground was level once more. As he tamped down the final patch of dirt, the wind shifted. It was no longer the gentle Kansas breeze that whispered through the cornfields. This was a different wind, colder, sharper, with a keening edge that seemed to scour the landscape. It swirled dust around his boots and tugged at his jacket. He started back toward the house, the shovel slung over his shoulder, when he heard it. A low, mournful cry, long and drawn out, echoed from the nearest grain silo. It wasn't the metallic groan of aging steel or the whistle of wind through a rusted seam. It was organic, sorrowful. Jake froze, his blood running cold. He told himself it was just the wind, a trick of acoustics in the hollow structure. But as he hurried his steps, the sound came again, this time seeming to rise from all 3 of his empty silos at once. A discordant chorus of grief that wrapped around the farmhouse and seeped through the walls, a lament for a peace that had been broken. Sleep was impossible. The chorus of cries from the silos was relentless, a symphony of anguish that seeped through the walls and into Jake's bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a heavy blanket of sorrow pressing down on the house. When the first sliver of dawn finally broke across the flat horizon, the wailing ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a silence that was almost as unnerving. Exhausted and raw, Jake forced himself out of bed. He had to know. He pulled on his boots and walked out into the chilly morning air, the frost crunching under his feet. He circled each of the 5 metal giants, his eyes scanning for any explanation. He ran his hands over the corrugated steel, cold and solid. He peered into the dark, empty interiors through the access hatches. There was nothing. No birds, no trapped coyotes, not even a loose panel that could vibrate in the wind. They were just empty, silent structures. The lack of a rational cause sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him. Back in the kitchen, Sarah was pouring coffee, her face etched with the familiar lines of worry over their finances. "You were tossing and turning all night," she said, not looking up from the counter. "Did you hear anything last night?" Jake asked, his voice hesitant. Sarah finally turned, a weary look in her eyes. "I heard the wind, Jake, same as always when a front is moving in. The house groans, the silos whistle, you're stressed." "We both are." She slid a cup of coffee toward him. "Don't go inventing new worries." Her dismissal, though gentle, felt like a wall between them. He was alone in this. Throughout the day, his unease grew. A wrench he'd left on the tractor engine was now sitting on the ground 10 feet away. The gate to the north pasture, which he'd triple-checked was latched, was swinging gently in the breeze. Each small, inexplicable event tightened the knot of fear in his stomach. As the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows of the silos across the yard, Jake stood by the window, watching them. The dread was no longer just a fear of the sound, but a certainty of it. The night was coming, and it was bringing the sorrow back with it. The sunset bled across the Kansas horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and bruised purple. Inside the farmhouse, a tense silence had replaced the usual evening chatter. Jake sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee, his eyes fixed on the window. Sarah moved quietly around him, her earlier skepticism replaced by a gnawing apprehension. She couldn't ignore the raw, primal fear she'd seen in her husband's eyes. As the last sliver of light vanished, it began. It was no longer a distant, mournful cry. The sound that rose from the silos was a raw, guttural keen of profound grief, louder and more insistent than the night before. It clawed at the farmhouse walls, a tangible presence that made the very air vibrate. Jake flinched, a low groan escaping his lips. "Jake, it's so much louder," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She moved to stand behind him, her hands resting on his rigid shoulders. The wailing rose in pitch, and within the cacophony, a new element emerged, a clear, sharp sound, like a word being torn from a throat. It was a single, repeated syllable in a language neither of them knew, but its meaning was unmistakable. A cry for something lost, a desperate, angry accusation. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, her fingers digging into Jake's shoulders. "Did you hear that?" she breathed, her eyes wide with terror. It sounds like it's saying a name." Jake nodded, unable to speak. He had heard it too. The sound wasn't wind or stress, it was personal. It was directed at them. They huddled together in the dimly lit kitchen for hours, prisoners in their own home, as the spectral lament echoed through the night. When dawn finally broke, the silence that fell was more deafening than the noise it replaced. Exhausted and hollowed out, they looked at each other. The last of Sarah's disbelief had been scoured away by the night's terror. "This can't go on," Jake said, his voice raspy. He stood up, his movements stiff. "I'm going into Havenwood. I have to find out who he was. I need to know the history of this land. Maybe Mr. Abernathy at the Historical Society knows something." Sarah nodded, her face pale but her expression resolute. "Go," she said. "I'll stay here, just find an answer, Jake. Find a way to make this right." Havenwood was less a town and more a memory clinging to the edge of the highway. A single blinking traffic light, a post office, and a few brick storefronts stood as weary sentinels of a bygone era. Jake parked his dusty truck in front of the Historical Society, a small, proud building with "Founded 1958" etched into its cornerstone. The air inside was still and smelled of old paper and lemon polish. An elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket looked up from a large, leather-bound book. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice dry as autumn leaves. "Hope so. I'm Jake Miller. My farm is a few miles west of here," Jake began, his hands fidgeting in his pockets. "I was hoping to see some old maps of the area, learn a bit more about the property." The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, seemed unimpressed. "Not much to tell. Been Miller land for 3 generations. Before that, railroad land. Corn and cattle, that's the history out there, son." Desperation gnawed at Jake. He leaned forward on the counter, lowering his voice. "I found something. In the west field, the one bordering the creek. Some old arrowheads, flint, and some beads." Abernathy's interest flickered. "Lots of folks find arrowheads. These were different," Jake insisted. "And there were turquoise beads. Small, sky blue, polished smooth like river stones." The change in Abernathy was immediate. He set his glasses down, his sharp eyes locking onto Jake's. "Turquoise," he repeated, the words holding a new weight. He pushed himself up from his stool with a groan and gestured for Jake to follow him into a cluttered back room filled with maps and filing cabinets. He unrolled a brittle, yellowed map on a large table. He pointed a trembling finger to a section marked with faded ink. "Your farm," he said, his voice now a low whisper. "It's on what was once known as the Weeping Bluff. It was sacred ground for the Kansa people." He pulled out a dusty ledger. "There's a story, a legend most people call it now, about a betrayal. Settlers promised a treaty and instead ambushed them." He paused, looking at Jake grimly. "They say one warrior, Kapata, which roughly means he who walks alone, was killed defending a burial site there. The legend says his spirit was bound to that ground, and if his rest was ever disturbed by outsiders, his sorrow would cry out on the wind for all to hear." The drive back from Havenwood was a silent, heavy journey. The setting sun painted the vast Kansas sky in hues of orange and deep purple, but Jake saw none of its beauty. He only saw the land as Mr. Abernathy had described it, a place of sacred trust and violent betrayal. The name echoed in his mind, a drumbeat of guilt, he who walks alone. It was no longer just a skeleton in a forgotten grave. It was a man, a warrior whose final piece he had shattered for the sake of his land. He found Sarah on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill, her face etched with worry. As he sat beside her on the worn wooden steps, the first cool breeze of the night whispered past them. He told her everything, the history of the Kaw tribe, the story of the betrayal, the legend of the warrior's cry. He didn't spare himself, admitting his desecration was not just of an anonymous grave, but of a specific person's final rest. Sarah listened without interruption, her hand finding his. When he finished, her fear was still there, but now it was layered with a deep, shared sorrow. "So, it's him," she whispered. "He's calling out." As if on cue, the sound began. It rose from the nearest silo, no longer just a mournful wail, but a sound thick with accusation. It felt clearer, more articulate, as if knowing they were finally listening gave it strength. Huddled together, they strained to listen, and through the wind, they both thought they heard it. A word, guttural and sharp, repeated in a rhythm of profound grief. They didn't understand the language, but they felt its meaning in their bones. A cry for justice, for peace. "We can't just live with this, Jake," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to make it right, not for us, for him." Jake looked from the darkened silos to his wife's determined face. The fear was still a cold knot in his stomach, but something else was growing alongside it. Resolve. Abernathy had mentioned the Kaw Nation had a tribal headquarters in Oklahoma. It was a long shot, a difficult path into a world they didn't understand, but it was the only path. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have to find them. We have to ask them how to bring him peace." The drive south to Kaw City, Oklahoma, was a pilgrimage of penance. The Kansas plains gave way to the rolling hills of the Osage Nation, each mile a silent admission of their transgression. They found the Kaw Nation headquarters, a modest brick building that felt more significant than any state capital. Inside, they were guided to an office where an elder named Lena Waite listened, her dark eyes holding a century of her people's patience and pain. Jake, his voice raw with humility, recounted the story from the beginning: the rusted plow, the desperate choice, the nightly cries that had hollowed out his soul. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, a silent testament to their shared burden. Lena heard them out without interruption. When Jake finished, the room was quiet save for the hum of a ceiling fan. "He who walks alone was not just a warrior," Lena said finally, her voice soft but firm. "He was a guardian of that land. Your fear was born of disrespect, but your journey here shows remorse. A spirit does not seek vengeance, but peace. We will help you give it to him." 2 days later, Lena stood by the open grave on their farm. She was accompanied by a young man who began a low, rhythmic chant in the Kansa language. The scent of burning sage filled the air, a clean, sharp fragrance that seemed to purify the very wind. With gentle reverence, they lowered the warrior's remains back into the earth, wrapping them in a new blanket alongside the original artifacts. Jake and Sarah stood back, humbled spectators to a ritual that felt both ancient and immediate, a mending of a wound that spanned generations. That night, for the first time in weeks, the farm was still. The wind whispered through the cornstalks, a natural, soothing sound. The silos stood dark and inert against the star-dusted sky, their haunting chorus replaced by a profound peace. The foreclosure letter still sat on their kitchen table, a stark reminder of their uncertain future. But standing on the porch, hand in hand, Jake and Sarah felt a different kind of solvency. They hadn't saved the farm yet, but they had honored its history. In the deep quiet of the Kansas night, that felt like a harvest all its own.